All right, it's section 9, closing costs, fees, and charges. And Mark, take it away, man.
So even though the contract defaults to say the following, seller pays these closing costs and buyer pays these closing costs, all closing costs in Florida are 100% negotiable unless it's a VA or FHA loan. And then under those circumstances, you're going to want to contact the lender and find out which fees the buyer cannot pay. But let's just see what the contract defaults to. So in this one, cost to be paid by the seller, documentary stamp taxes and surtaxes on the deed. If you're dealing with somebody out of state, they have no idea what that is.
Right.
Of course, they did buy property, but they probably didn't pay the doc stamps on the deed. What that is, state of Florida, no state income tax, which is kind of nice. However, when you buy real property, one way the state of Florida makes their money to never improve our roads is these doc stamps. And the way you calculate those, you merely take the sales price, divide by 100, and multiply by 0.7.
All right.
So on $1 million closing, that's $7,000. That's considerable.
Yeah. So that formula is divide by 100, multiply by 0.7.
Correct.
And that's going to tell you what the doc stamp is going to be.
That is correct.
So that defaults in the contract, but it's negotiable.
That is correct.
So there is a strong likelihood, and I know that for our team, we say for properties, once it surpasses that, we're going to close with Mark Violet, PA, and the seller is to pay, will take on the owner title, but the buyer is going to pay this doc stamp, because at a certain price point, it's better to pay for title, owner's title, and the seller to pay the doc stamp because it's more expensive.
Correct. So at this point in time, the Mendoza line is about $500,000.
Gotcha.
So again, if you're doing a $1 million property, doc stamps are always going to be $7,000, whereas title insurance may be $5,000. So there's already a $2,000 savings if you tell your client, say you're doing listings, and you explain to the seller, we're going to put in the agent remarks, all contracts need to be submitted with the seller paying owner's title policy and the buyer paying doc stamps. You just save them $2,000 at a minimum.
At that, as you say, that threshold is about 500,000 and above.
Correct.
When you go below that, it's inverted. Okay.
Yeah, the next couple have to do with owner's title policy and title charges and municipal liens, but you're going to see it says if paragraph 9 something is checked. So later down, we're going to talk about if those are checked, but sometimes, like we said, you may want the seller paying owner's title policy, so you're going to check the appropriate box, and then these would come into play.
There we go.
A municipal lien search. So that's something that popped up because South Florida, people were selling their properties and not paying their water sewer bills, or they weren't paying certain municipal charges. So in South Florida, they passed legislation that said now if the seller doesn't pay, that sticks with the property. Whereas in our area, that hasn't happened. Maybe out in Bay County, but we're in Okaloosa, Walton, Santa Rosa. So we don't deal with it too often. But if a buyer's paying cash, we'll just ask them, do you want a municipal lien search? And we kind of explain to them what it does. If there's a lender involved, we will always order a municipal lien search because they just want to see it. But ultimately in our area, nothing that shows up on that municipal lien search stops us from issuing free and clear title. Now, there may be open expired permits on the property, and if you represent a buyer, you don't want them to inherit those problems. So the simple solution usually is buyer's agent calls a listing agent and says your seller needs to call the county or the city, whoever it is, and get this cleared up. And these days, it's not really a problem at all.
Cool. Charges for FIRPTA, withholding and reporting.
So that's if your seller is what we call a foreign entity, they don't file taxes in the United States, then there's additional forms that need to be completed. That is an hour conversation on its own. So just be aware. Usually the closing company is aware because we have to ask for the seller's social. And if they don't have one, that's a red flag that FIRPTA may be subject.
So once again, all of these areas are negotiable. HOA, condominium, association, estoppel fees.
So if the property itself is either a single family residence, townhome, or condominium subject to a mandatory homeowners association, as a closing company, we have to contact the association and get certain information. How much are the dues? Are they monthly, quarterly, yearly? Is the seller current on the dues? Are there any anticipated special assessments coming? They charge a fee to provide that simple information to us. And since it's something that the seller, a buyer, if they're not an owner, is not a member, they can't demand
Right.
that the association provide information. So that's why that defaults to the seller's going to pay. Traditionally, it's between $250 and $350.
And for everybody, once again, that word estoppel.
Right. Estoppel means we as a closing company can rely on the information being provided to us by the association. And believe me, this comes up more than I ever want it to, because usually, let's say 4 months after closing, the new buyer calls me up and says, the association says I owe them because you did not collect from the seller. And I say, let's go check the estoppel letter and see what it says. And that's my saving grace to go back to them and say, they completed it incorrectly if they're alleging you owe them money or the seller owed them money. Show this to them, and usually that's where it dies.
There we go. All right. Recording and other fees needed to cure title.
And as we go down the contract again, there will be a section where the seller is required to convey marketable title. And if they can't, sometimes we need to do a quick claim deed or something like that. That's going to be a cost of the seller.
All right. And that other, what might someone put in the other blank?
Sometimes we'll put, let's say the buyer and seller agree that the seller is going to pay all closing costs. This could be where you can put seller agrees to pay all closing costs, or something along those lines. Traditionally, I tell you, use the additional provisions so you can clarify, because the line is not that long.
It's just not big enough.
Yeah. Let's say they had we all know that they got their solar power and the solar power has a loan against it, or something like that. So those can be assumed by the buyer, but maybe the buyer says, hey, it's a buyer's market, I don't want that bill. So you would put seller to pay off solar loan or lien or whatever.
Cool. All right, now we come to the pre-negotiated repairs, and this has to do with general repairs, wood-destroying organisms, treatment and repairs, and costs associated with open or expired building permits. The default, if you leave it blank, and I don't recommend you do that, is 1.5%. You buy a $500,000 home, leave it blank, they're on the hook for $7,500. And $7,500 and $7,500 and $7,500, theoretically, that's what, $22,500. Very rarely do you see it
maxed out.
However, I would say if you are working with a seller and those are blank, you need to do the math and say, hey, look, you're agreeing to up to this amount, the 1.5 times 3 of the sales price. Not a good deal.
And you're also agreeing, essentially, if it's less than that amount, you will hire somebody to fix it.
Right.
And maybe the seller says, I don't know what's behind my walls. I don't want them fixing anything. Let's put 0. And if they want something, we can just put seller will give a debit credit to the buyer on the settlement statement in the amount of whatever. So if you're dealing with older property, this is usually where it comes up.
All right. So in this, what you're looking at, and I want you to think, if you're working with the buyer, a good way of looking at it is you've gone in, you've looked at the home, you've had an idea of the general condition of the home. Now, things will come up in a home inspection, but you have kind of a sense of, did I see a lot of problems, or did it look pretty pristine? There can always be things lurking behind the wall, but you have an idea of about what you may be facing, and that's where you would put in a dollar amount. A lot of, and keep in mind, this is not cosmetic. It's the important moving pieces here.
Correct.
So any comments on these areas?
I think it's a matter of just knowing your client and knowing the property itself. Older properties obviously are going to, through the inspection, likely going to come up with higher dollar amounts. General repairs is the more important one. I mean, WDO, I guess in our area, Any property that's more than a year old, likely an outside door is going to have some wood rot somewhere. So you can expect that. And then the permit limit, again, that in our area is not that big of a deal. And usually it's not more than a couple $100 or something. So if you're going to go low on any of the three, I would just, and you can go in the public records or call the county building and planning zoning department and say, hey, are you showing expired, open, or whatever permits before you even submit a contract, so you'll know in advance. But the permit one, you could probably put a couple $100.
That doesn't mean sometimes, for instance, a agent that I'm coaching right now, the homeowner did the roof replacement themselves without a permit ever being generated. And so now the city was requiring that it get looked at, and basically a roofer affirmed that it's good. And everybody was like, all right, we'll come out there for $3,000. So it's not that it couldn't be. That's not, I'm not sure that that would fall here, but they had to get something for the city or the county saying, hey, this work is up to code. So be mindful that if somebody has done work that is needed to be permitted, that they have actually done permitted work and not just kind of did it on their own, because that could bite you through the process.
Yeah, and really you'll see it in electrical. So if somebody hired an electrician, it's behind the drywall. The city or county could say we need to rip open the drywall, inspect it, and then it's at the expense of the seller to close the drywall, paint it, which we all know how matching paint works sometimes, but not sometimes, and you could have issues. But
so the main thing that I see is if you're working with the seller, you have an idea of if the repairs coming back that are being requested fall within these ranges, that money is spent up to that amount. And for the seller, you have an idea of worst case scenario if you maxed out on general repairs, wood destroying organisms, and permits being completed. That's going to affect the net, but you know what you can net. Helps to really have that conversation with your seller. For the buyer, you're wanting to make sure that there is enough meat on the bone to cover those repairs that may come up as well.
Yeah, and one thing that always gets confusing for new agents is this general repair limit area is separate and apart from if your buyer's doing an FHA or VA loan. That's the lender sends out what they call an appraiser, who's really an inspector. So you will have your own private inspector, and that's what this is talking about. And then you'll have the VA addendum or FHA addendum for anything that the lenders
require.
Right.
All right. So last thing that I'm just going to, as your coach, speak into is, and we'll touch on it later on, is if the inspection comes back with issues that fall within these price amounts and the seller says, I'll repair it, the buyer must buy. I mean, they're still under obligation to buy. Sometimes, however, buyers will learn of things in the inspection that kind of knock the shine off the deal. They fall out of love and they're wanting out, but the repairs are within the limits. We need to prepare our buyers with, hey, there may be things that come up that you don't necessarily like, that maybe you fall a little out of love. You need to understand, without a right to inspect and cancel addendum, if they agree to pay and repair within these limits, you're going to buy. All right? Is that correct. A fair way of saying it?
Yeah, but you have to know your contracts to make sure that the contracts actually say that information.
There we go. So always read the contract. Anything in the section from line 151 down that we need to be aware of?
Again, that's a catch-all for, let's say we all agree repairs need to be done. Seller goes out to get estimates. Everybody's super busy and they're like, well, we can't get them done before closing, but we will get them done and the price is fixed. All that's going to say is the closing company is going to collect up to 125% of the amount due, which allows it to be done after closing. Now, if there's a lender involved, they probably won't allow that to happen. So there's going to be an addendum extending closing, but that's what that section's going to say.
There we go. So costs to be paid by buyer.
Right. So essentially, they're saying if you're going to get a lender or a loan, buyer, you should bear those expenses. Again, completely negotiable. So the defaults are going to be your tax recording fees on the note and the mortgage. So when you borrow money, again, state of Florida, no state income tax. So they're going to tax you on the borrowing of money. On the mortgage, you take the total amount of the mortgage, divide by 100, multiply by 0.35.
Okay. So half of the
The
other.
doc stamps.
Yep.
And the note, you take the total amount of the note and multiply by 0.002. How they came up with those numbers, I have no idea, but those are your numbers.
All right.
Recording fees for deeds and financing statements. A financing statement is really on a commercial loan, which is called the UCC1. You're not going to see those on residential transactions. Here again, we have the owner's policy and charges if paragraph 9, whatever is checked. So that's allowing in this contract seller to pay or buyer to pay. Now, survey. If you're a listing agent, you should ask your seller, do you have a prior survey? And has there been any structural modifications since the day of the survey? And if the seller says, I do have one and I have not made any changes, you should put in the agent notes, seller has a prior survey and will sign an affidavit of no changes. That way, the buyer does not necessarily have to get a new survey. Now, the buyer may say, it's a 1980s house. It's been 40 years. I don't care what the seller says. I want to go pay my $500 and go get a new survey. They certainly have all the rights in the world to do that.
All right. So lender's title policy and endorsements, usually very small amount. I usually see about $100. Is that right?
Yeah. So in Florida, if you're getting an owner's policy and a lender's policy simultaneously, the lesser of the two amounts, and people will get confused. So if you have a VA or FHA loan, traditionally the loan amount exceeds the purchase price. And then since the loan exceeds the purchase, then the loan policy is the more expensive one, and the owner's policy is only $100.
Ah, interesting.
So they used to call it primary and secondary, but it's just called lender's title policy and owner's title policy. So you need to be aware if you're allocating closing cost, if they're doing an FHA or VA loan, you're probably going to have a loan amount that exceeds, and that means the lender's policy is going to be the expensive one.
There we go. All right, now let's move down to title evidence and insurance.
So this is where we're going to do a title search. Let's see. Yeah, so as a closing company, we order what's called a title search or title commitment through First American Title Insurance. They search the public records. They're supposed to catch any defects that need to be cured. Gives us the roadmap for we need to do a warranty deed from seller to buyer. We need to do a mortgage. We need to contact the association, make sure that there's no past due association dues or anything like that. So it's our checklist. And then normally, if it's clean, we shoot an email out that just says, hey, it's clean. It's all good. If it's not clean, we'll shoot it to the buyer's agent and say, listen, things to note, because that means something has to happen. Closing may be delayed. We don't want anybody. I know it says 5 days prior to closing. We don't wait 5 days. As soon as you give us the contract, we order our title commitment immediately. We usually have it within 2 days, and we've sent it out to everybody within 2 days of receipt of it.
There we go. All right. So in Section C, I know that we have 3 things to check.
Correct.
And that is seller shall designate closing agent and pay owner's title policy and charges, or buyer shall designate closing agent and pay for owner's policy.
Right.
And of course, there's the Miami-Dade, Broward.
You can, if you're not practicing in Miami-Dade or Broward, you can completely ignore that and never know what it has to say.
Yes.
So just understand there's different verbiages in the different contracts. In the seller shall designate closing agent and pay. One says, if you look at line 185, it says, and charges for closing services related to the lender's policy, endorsements, and loan closing. And the other contract, I think, just says, and related services.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't define what related services is. So depending on the version of the contract, there are local title companies who will put a fee on both the buyer side and the seller side, even though the contract says the seller shall pay charges and closing services related to lender's policy, endorsements, and loan closing. Mm-hmm. And their logic is, well, even though the seller chose us as a closing company, because the buyer has a lender, we have to do a lot more work. So we're going to ding the buyer for that. And I've gone back and I said, show me the contract, because show me in the contract where it says the closing agent has the right to charge a buyer for a fee that the buyer did not agree to in the contract. So be aware of the language in the specific contract that you're using.
All right. And in this, if you are representing the buyer and you're wanting the seller to pay owner's title insurance, and keep in mind, owner's title basically says we will convey and we will insure if there are any issues, there's an insurance policy to clear it up. Correct? Is that a
Correct.
good way of explaining it?
Yep.
Um, if you're expecting the seller to pay for it, then in that line you put to be determined by seller. If you're checking and saying, hey, the buyer's going to pay that owner's title policy, you choose Mark Violet.
Right. Right.
So in that, just be aware, if you're expecting the seller to pay, don't go ahead and fill in your person. And if you're working with a seller and they're requesting the seller to pay, but they've already listed in a title company, my belief is you can technically come back and say, nope, we're going to pay, but we're going to choose. You have every right to do that. That's the contract.
Correct. As long as, I think what you're saying is this: if you had a conversation with the seller, like let's say for instance, has nothing to do with who's picking or selecting, but the seller says, do not submit to me any offers less than $500,000, and an offer comes in at $495,000. You can tell the other agent, I'm not submitting that to the seller because you have specific information from the seller not to. So if you've had the conversation with the seller about choosing closing companies and doc stamps versus title insurance, and the seller has authorized you to put in the agent notes, make sure all contracts come in with seller paying owners and selecting Mark Violet PA or whatever it is, then you can go immediately back to the buyer's agent and let them know the seller's going to reject that. We've already had the conversation.
There we go.
Yeah.
But sometimes the conversation has to be, do you want to die on this hill or do you want to be under contract?
Correct.
So, all right. Survey, at least 5 days prior to closing.
Yeah, so surveys, depending on rainy season, how busy surveyors were, during 2020 through 2022, I mean, surveyors were saying, give me 45 days.
Yeah.
So we're used to 30-day, get your financing done, get everything done. But because of that, and that's where it became important to ask the seller, do you have an existing survey? Can you sign an affidavit? But make sure you check in. We have a whole survey class, so we don't have to go over too much right here.
Perfect. Home warranty?
So as a closing company, we don't do anything with ordering the home warranty. Why, you would ask? Well, we've said this before. Out of everybody involved in a closing transaction, who's the one company that never goes out to the property? The closing company. Unless it's me doing the closing, because I will go do the closing at the property, but by then it's too late.
Yeah.
So I don't know if the house has a hip roof or a gable roof or has a pool or a spa. So really, I think this should be done by the buyer and the buyer's agent, because a lot of these home warranties also say, hey, do you want this additional coverage? Do you want this one? And, without the buyer saying, well, how much is it? And yes, I do, or no, I don't. Then you can always check whatever you want and put not to exceed 500. But like I said, as a buyer's agent, I would go over the individual home warranties and see what coverages they want.
And once again, depending on the market, you may want to request that of the seller to pay. The buyer may want it and just go ahead and check it, and the buyer's going to pay. It really depends upon that section. Now, let's come on down to this
the last
little section, which is special assessments.
Right.
A lot of people begin to get that confused with HOA assessments or things like that. That's not this.
That is not this, correct. This is solely if there's a special assessment by what we call a public body, a municipality, a city, a county, a CDC. So essentially, if you've been around long enough, I think Hammock Bay had where they got a grant to put in certain infrastructure or water, sewer, and they assessed each house with a monthly fee. You could pay it off in full if you want, but it has absolutely nothing to do with a condominium association or your homeowners association. Those are separate mandatory addendums that you must attach if those are applicable. So you can ask around. It's common knowledge which subdivisions, and most of them are going to be out towards the East and Freeport area, if they're subject to any of these special assessments by basically public body.
So think in terms of paved roads, sidewalks, things of that nature, where the government entity does it and then charges it back to the residents. And this is where it's important to inquire, if there is, what is that amount? Because it may be just a few dollars a month of assessment, but it's paid out over 20 years, and to ask the seller to pay it in full prior to closing could be $10, $15, $20,000, and that could kill the deal. Whereas it would be just, maybe it might be $50 a month to the total mortgage payment. So the options are: seller shall make installment payments up to closing, and then buyer will take over, or the seller's going to pay it in full prior to, and it's cleared.
Right. Now, understand, as a listing agent, line 215 is in caps. If neither box is checked, then option A shall be deemed selected, which means you've now agreed your seller's paying everything in full prior to closing.
Well, it says, Part A says, seller shall pay installments due prior to closing, and buyer shall pay installments due after closing. So in that, it's kind of passing of a baton. So if neither is checked, then option A shall be deemed selected.
There we go. Yep.
So that's really kind of, we're passing the baton. You're picking up this special assessment after. So that really that's Section 9, folks. And let's go write some contracts. We'll come back with Section 10 on disclosures, and let's keep moving forward.